A man woke up in the middle of the night to smoke in his kitchen. He called the fire brigade, knocked on his neighbor's doors, and walked out of the building. Less than 30 minutes later, that building was burning from the ground to the roof. 72 people never made it out. What you're about to discover is not just what happened that night, but everything that had happened before it. The decisions made in boardrooms and council offices, the warnings raised and ignored, the voices that were heard, and the ones that were deliberately silenced. If you want to understand how any of this was possible, stay with us until the very end. To understand what happened at Grenfell Tower, you first need to understand where it stood and who lived inside it, because neither of those things is accidental. North Kensington is a neighborhood in West London that holds one of the most striking contrasts you will find anywhere in Europe. Walk in one direction, and you're standing in front of houses that sell for 20 or 30 million pounds, streets lined with boutiques and private members' clubs, and the kind of restaurants where a dinner for two costs what most people earn in a week. Walk in the other direction, and you reach the Lancaster West Estate, a social housing complex built in the 1960s as part of a government scheme to clear old slums and give working people somewhere decent to live. The same borough, a completely different world, and somewhere in the geography of that gap lies the beginning of this story. Grenfell Tower stood at the heart of that estate, a concrete block 24 stories tall, completed in the early 1970s and built in the brutalist architectural style of the era, all raw concrete and straight lines, functional rather than beautiful. 129 flats spread across those floors were home to one of the most genuinely diverse communities in London, including families from Ethiopia, Somalia, Syria, Morocco, Sudan, the Philippines, and Afghanistan, people who had come from every corner of the world and built their lives in those rooms. There were elderly residents who had called the building home for decades, young families with children, people working long shifts in hospitals and restaurants and warehouses, an artist, a teacher, refugees who had survived wars and crossed borders and finally found what they believed was safety in those walls. There were people who knew each other in the corridors, who shared food during Ramadan, who looked after each other's children. It was by every measure a real and rooted community. Now, the question of who was actually responsible for that building matters enormously to this story. So, it is worth taking a moment to understand it clearly. Since the late 1990s, the management of Grenfell Tower had been entrusted to a private organization set up by the local council, a body responsible for overseeing its entire social housing portfolio of around 10,000 homes across the borough. Instead of residents having any direct line to elected officials who could be challenged and held to account, they had to go through this organization, and for years, that relationship was a source of frustration that went far deeper than ordinary tenant dissatisfaction. Residents described an organization that fundamentally did not listen to them, that dismissed their complaints as a matter of habit and treated the concerns of the very people it was supposed to serve as nuisances rather than legitimate issues requiring action. A group of residents eventually formed a campaign called the Grenfell Action Group and began documenting their concerns publicly, writing about fire safety problems that were raised and systematically ignored, about an organization they believed could not be held to account in any meaningful way. The campaign tried repeatedly to be recognized formally so that it could engage as a collective voice. That recognition was refused. When one resident began blogging about the conditions in the tower and the failures of the organization managing it, the council's own legal department sent him a letter instructing him to remove what he had written. He did not stop writing. The building itself had a history that should have alarmed anyone paying close attention. A fire had broken out in a lobby years before the main disaster, and smoke spread through 8 floors, trapping residents in their homes in what was by any measure a genuinely dangerous and frightening event. When this was reported upward by the management organization to its own board, the public inquiry later found that the account given was a gross understatement of what had actually occurred, and that key information about what went wrong had been deliberately withheld so that those responsible for oversight would not know the true scale of the failure. Around the same period, the London Fire Brigade visited the tower and declared its smoke ventilation system broken beyond repair, a system that was supposed to funnel smoke away from residents in the event of a fire and keep escape routes clear. It was left completely unfixed for 6 years. 60 residents eventually came together to sign a formal petition stating that their safety concerns had been belittled and brushed aside. It achieved nothing. And what is most striking, looking at all of this accumulated evidence, is not any absence of information, but precisely the opposite. The concerns are documented, the warnings were written down, the inspectors visited and produced their reports, the residents petitioned and organized and raised their voices, and none of it produced the outcome it should have produced. The building continued to operate year after year, with its known problems unaddressed. While the people sleeping inside it went on trusting that someone in the chain of responsibility was making sure they were safe. What those residents could not have known was that something was about to make everything significantly worse, that a decision had been made to modernize the building, and that the way that modernization was carried out would transform every flaw that already existed in Grenfell Tower into something permanent and irreversible. A few years before the fire, a decision was made to refurbish Grenfell Tower. New windows, a new heating system, a new exterior. For the people living inside, this genuinely seemed like welcome news. What actually happened during that refurbishment, however, is one of the most consequential chains of decisions in recent British history, and it begins not with safety, but with appearances. The refurbishment was part of a wider regeneration project happening around the estate, with a new school being built next door and a new leisure center going up nearby. And within the council and the management of the building, there was a clear and stated view that Grenfell Tower needed to look better, not simply function better for the hundreds of people living inside it, but look better to the world outside. One council official, testifying later to the public inquiry, described the thinking at the time with striking candor. She wanted the tower to stop looking like, in her own words, a poor cousin to the brand new facility next door. A planning document submitted by the council stated plainly that changes to the building would improve its appearance, especially when viewed from the surrounding area. The cladding being placed on the outside of the building was not purely about thermal insulation, but about aesthetics, about making a social housing tower block look presentable in a neighborhood that was becoming increasingly wealthy and increasingly intolerant of anything that looked out of place. That pressure shaped every decision that followed. The original plan had called for zinc cladding on the exterior, a solid, durable, non-combustible material that simply does not burn. But zinc was more expensive, and when the original contractor priced the full job and came in over budget, he was dropped in favor of a new contractor who won the work at a significantly lower price. Somewhere in that process of cutting costs, the zinc was swapped out for something called aluminum composite material, panels made of two thin sheets of aluminum bonded to a core of polyethylene plastic, the same basic material used in shopping bags and food packaging, wrapped around the outside of a 24-story building where hundreds of people slept. The saving made by switching from the safe option to the cheaper one amounted to less than £300,000, and the difference in cost between the fire-resistant version of the product and the polyethylene version used on the building was £2 per square meter. Behind those outer panels, an insulation foam was installed that, when ignited, would not simply produce flames, but would generate dense black smoke, intense heat, and a combination of toxic gases, including carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. 3 people who survived the fire were later treated in hospital specifically for cyanide poisoning. Beyond the choice of materials, there was a further decision made for purely aesthetic reasons that would prove catastrophic. Rather than bolting the outer panels flat against the wall in the simplest and cheapest way, they were cut, shaped, and hung on hidden rails in what is known as a cassette configuration, because this produced a smoother and more elegant visual finish. What nobody in the decision-making chain appears to have fully grasped, or chose to address, was that this method of installation exposed significantly more of the polyethylene core and made the panels dramatically more dangerous in a fire. Tests demonstrating exactly this had already been conducted more than a decade earlier by the very company that manufactured the panels, and those results had never been published. At the very top of the tower, a decorative architectural crown was added as a finishing touch designed to give the building a more elegant roofline, a detail that would later catch fire when the flames reached it and cause them to spread horizontally around the entire building in a way that made the Grenfell Tower fire unlike any cladding fire ever recorded anywhere else in the world. And through all of this, no sprinkler system was installed, no building-wide fire alarm was fitted, and there remained a single staircase as the only way in and the only way out for every one of the hundreds of people who lived there, all of it permitted under British building regulations at the time. The work signed off by building control inspectors and declared finished. Then, barely a month after the refurbishment ended, An independent fire safety assessor visited Grenfell Tower and identified 40 serious issues, recommending urgent action. When he returned months later, more than 20 of those issues remained completely unaddressed. The fire brigade subsequently served a formal deficiency notice listing multiple safety failures requiring attention by a specific deadline. That deadline came and passed with nothing of substance done. The building that stood in North Kensington on the night of the fire was not simply a concrete tower block. Its exterior had been wrapped in materials that had never been genuinely tested together as a complete system. Its documented safety problems had been recorded and then ignored, and the hundreds of people living inside had absolutely no idea that any of this was true. Just before 1 in the morning on a Wednesday in June, a man named Bihalu Kabeta woke in his flat on the 4th floor of Grenfell Tower to find smoke coming from his kitchen, his fridge freezer on fire. He called emergency services, went into the corridor, knocked on his neighbor's doors, and got himself out of the building, an entirely ordinary response to what, at that moment, appeared to be an entirely ordinary kitchen fire. The first fire crew arrived within minutes, and from where they stood outside looking up at the building, what they saw appeared manageable. The fundamental principle behind fire safety in every British high-rise residential building was simple and had been standard practice for decades. If a fire breaks out inside one flat, the thick concrete structure and fire-resistant compartments hold it in place while the fire brigade deals with it, and everyone in every other flat stays exactly where they are, trusts the building to protect them, and waits. That principle, however, required one thing above everything else to be true, that the fire would remain inside the building. Within 15 minutes of the first crew arriving, the fire reached the exterior cladding, and what happened next had never been witnessed in Britain before, and nobody at that scene had ever been trained to handle. The polyethylene core of the outer panels ignited, and because of the way those panels had been installed, cut and shaped, and hung on rails with their plastic core exposed, they did not catch fire in one place and contain themselves there. They became a channel, a highway for fire, the flames climbing the outside of the building with a speed that witnesses described as extraordinary and almost unreal, and as the polyethylene melted, it dripped downward, carrying fire below. At the very same moment, the blaze was racing upward. The gap between the outer cladding and the insulation layer behind it acted like a chimney, pulling air upward and driving the fire toward the roof. 27 minutes after that first fire crew arrived, the flames reached the top of the building. The decorative crown ignited, and fire began spreading horizontally in all 4 directions until every side of Grenfell Tower was simultaneously burning. Inside, hundreds of people were waking up in darkness, some to the smell of smoke, some to the sound of neighbors banging on their doors, some to calls from relatives who were watching the news, and every one of them found the same guidance when they looked for it. A leaflet, a notice on the wall, instructions that had been there for as long as they had lived in the building, telling them clearly, stay in your flat, do not use the staircase, do not try to leave, the fire brigade is on its way, and the building is designed to protect you. Many people followed that advice exactly, going back inside, closing the doors behind them, and waiting while the fire burned not below them in a single flat on the 4th floor, but on every surface of the exterior of the building above them, below them, and beside them simultaneously. Others ignored the instructions entirely, grabbing what they could and running for the staircase. And those people, the ones who went against the official guidance and fled, are overwhelmingly the ones who survived. Over 100 people evacuated in the first 35 minutes. Alive today, primarily because they made a decision that contradicted everything they had been told was the right thing to do. In the control room, phones were ringing without stopping, around 120 calls coming in simultaneously from residents on different floors, people describing smoke pouring into their flats, people asking desperately what they should do, people telling the operators they could not breathe and could feel the heat coming through their walls and could not get to the door. The guidance being given to different callers was inconsistent. Some told to stay, some told to go, some reassured that help was on its way when the people supposed to help them had no clear picture of what was actually happening inside the building. The incident commanders on the ground had no floor plans, and the operational database available to them contained minimal and in some places inaccurate information about the structure of the tower. A high-reach ladder that could have directed water onto the burning exterior panels from outside took more than half an hour to arrive, and when hoses were finally connected to the mains water supply, the pressure was insufficient, requiring Thames Water to be contacted and asked to increase it remotely. There is a particular detail about that night that is difficult to absorb. This exact failure and how emergency calls from trapped residents were managed have been documented and specifically highlighted after a fatal fire in another London tower block years earlier. Recommendations have been made, procedures were supposedly updated, and the inquiry found that very little had actually changed. The people on those phones, calling in desperation for guidance from the upper floors of a burning building, were failed not only by the materials wrapped around the walls, but by a system that had already been told it was inadequate and had chosen not to become better. Shortly after 2:30 in the morning, the stay put instruction was formally abandoned and an evacuation order issued for the entire building. But by that point, the single stairwell was filled with smoke at a level that constituted a direct and immediate threat to life. And after the order was given, only 36 more people managed to get out. The public inquiry later concluded that if that evacuation order had come 80 minutes earlier, while the staircase was still passable, many of those who died would have survived. At 4:30 in the morning, the entire building was engulfed. Firefighters working inside floor by floor in conditions a colleague watching from outside described as almost impossible, his fellow firefighters going up fresh-faced and coming back down looking hollow, as though something had been taken from them. The smoke so thick, he said, it was like moving through liquid, and virtually everyone who came back down the stairs could not speak. Some residents, believing the fire was below them and that safety lay higher up, had climbed to the upper floors to wait. Some made phone calls to the people they loved to say goodbye. Some fell or jumped from the building, including a 5-year-old boy named Isaac Paulos who was separated from his family as they fled from the 18th floor and did not survive. The building burned for 60 hours in total, and when it was finally over, 223 people had made it out and 72 had not, among them a baby named Logan Gomez, the youngest victim, who was stillborn in hospital the morning after the fire. His mother had survived. He had not. Identifying all of the dead took 5 months. Using every source available, CCTV recordings, DNA analysis, dental records, and the names that emerged told the story of an entire community. Artists, pensioners, refugees, parents, children, people who had done nothing wrong except live in a building they trusted. The word that the public inquiry used again and again. After 7 years of investigation, more than 300,000 documents examined, and 1,700 pages of findings, was not negligence or accident or error. It was dishonesty. Start with the company that manufactured the outer panels, the cladding the inquiry identified as the primary cause of the fire spreading, a multinational aluminum firm called Arconic, which had conducted its own internal fire tests on this product years before any refurbishment of Grenfell Tower took place. Those tests showed, with complete clarity, that when the panels were installed in the cassette configuration that would be used on the building, they performed catastrophically, burning 10 times more intensely, releasing 7 times more heat, and producing 3 times more smoke than the same panels installed flat against a wall. These results were known inside the company, were not published, and were not disclosed to any certifying authority. When Arconic later sought to obtain a British safety certificate, it submitted test results from a different and more fire-resistant version of its panel rather than the polyethylene version that would go on a Grenfell Tower, and a certificate was issued on that false basis. Meanwhile, an Arconic executive who had attended an industry conference where a presentation warned that attaching this type of panel to a tall building was the equivalent of wrapping it in an oil tanker reported those concerns back to his colleagues. Internal documents raised the specific possibility of 60 to 70 people dying in a fire involving their panels, and the company kept selling the product in Britain regardless, even as the same material had already been effectively banned for use on tall buildings in the United States. The company that made the insulation installed behind those panels had pursued an equally troubling course. It had set out to compete in a market segment that its own internal communications acknowledged it was not properly equipped to enter, and when its plastic foam product failed its first formal fire safety test, it kept pushing until it passed, on its second attempt, but only because, as investigation later revealed, additional fireproof boards had been secretly placed inside the test configuration, boards that were never declared in the official report and were never present when the product was actually installed in real buildings. The certificate that came out of that manipulated test stated the product was suitable for buildings above 18 meters in height, and on the basis of that certificate, the insulation was marketed across the country and installed on at least 240 tower blocks. The inquiry called this systematic dishonesty. The certifying body that had issued safety certificates for both of these products had itself been misled, had issued documents based on false and incomplete information, and those documents have been relied upon across the entire British construction industry as trustworthy guarantees. When the contractors choosing materials for the Grenfell Tower refurbishment consulted those certificates and saw the safety classifications they carried, they proceeded in good faith on information that had been deliberately corrupted. Every link in the chain had been contaminated by information that was withheld or falsified at its source. The inquiry then turned its attention to how the building had been managed in the years before the fire and found what it described as a culture of concealment, not an accumulation of oversights, but a deliberate and sustained pattern of behavior in which fire risk assessments have been inadequate for years. A formal fire safety strategy for the building had still not been properly approved at the time of the fire, and information about known safety problems had been repeatedly withheld from the organization's own board of directors and from the council that was supposed to be monitoring its performance. When serious concerns were raised by residents, those raising them were characterized as an unrepresentative, difficult minority whose complaints lacked merit and could be disregarded, a conclusion the inquiry found to be not merely inadequate, but a serious dereliction of the most basic duty of care. And then there was the government. This type of fire, in which exterior cladding on a high-rise building ignites and drives flames upward across the entire facade, was not without precedent, with buildings in Dubai, Bucharest, and elsewhere having burned in similar ways, and a coroner in Britain investigating a fatal fire in a London tower block some years before Grenfell had made specific formal recommendations to government that included retrofitting sprinklers in social housing tower blocks and reviewing how exterior cladding materials were tested and classified. The government declined to act on those recommendations, citing cost and a commitment to reducing regulation and a view that existing rules were already sufficient. The inquiry concluded that they were not and had not been for many years. The total financial cost of the fire, encompassing the rehousing of survivors, the public inquiry, the criminal investigation, civil court settlements, and the work on the site itself, has been estimated at close to £1.5 billion, most of it borne by the public. The company whose cladding was identified as the primary cause of the fire spreading paid a civil settlement of £47 million while spending $35 million on its own legal representation in the process. And as of today, not one individual and not one company has faced a criminal charge in connection with these deaths. The police say the investigation continues, that the volume of material is enormous, and that any prosecutions will not arrive before the end of this decade. For the families of those who died, that is not a timeline. It is an open wound. The morning after the fire, people who had escaped with nothing but the clothes they were wearing were searching for neighbors, for relatives, for any information at all about who had made out. One man visited 11 hospitals in a single day, looking for 6 members of his own family, describing later how he had moved through intensive care units pulling back curtains around beds, looking for faces he recognized, knowing it was wrong, but driven by a desperation that overtook every other consideration. The official response to the survivors was widely described as chaotic and at times callous in ways that are genuinely difficult to read about. People were placed in hotels, some on high floors, which for people who had just watched their home burn from the top was its own particular cruelty. Families were not always informed of their legal rights or what support was available to them. Muslim families were not provided with halal food. Wheelchair users were placed in accommodation they could not navigate, and a pregnant disabled woman and her family were put in a single hotel room where she slept on the floor for weeks. The council's legal representative later described the provision of hotel rooms for displaced families on the first night as an achievement. The families themselves used different words entirely. While the institutions failed, the community did not. Before any formal response was organized or any government task force assembled, people simply arrived. Mosques opened their doors through the night. Churches became distribution centers. Volunteers brought food, water, clothing, nappies, blankets, phone chargers, and toys for children who had lost everything. And within a single day, some of those local centers were so overwhelmed with donated goods that they had to post messages asking people to stop bringing more. The people of North Kensington held each other up in a way that the organizations paid to do so had consistently failed to do. In the weeks that followed, government surveys began identifying other residential buildings across the country that had been fitted with the same type of outer panels as Grenfell Tower. And the numbers grew quickly and then kept growing, the crisis eventually extending to thousands of buildings, residential blocks, hospitals, schools, student halls, care homes, leaving the people living inside them in an impossible position. They could not sell their homes because no mortgage lender would issue a loan on a building with unsafe cladding, and they could not afford to fix the problem themselves because remediation costs ran into tens of thousands of pounds per flat, driving some toward bankruptcy and leaving others still living in buildings with dangerous cladding years after a fire had shown the entire country exactly how those materials behaved. New legislation was eventually passed. Combustible cladding banned on new buildings above a certain height, sprinkler requirements strengthened, a Building Safety Act giving leaseholders stronger legal protections. But as of today, thousands of residential buildings across the country have still not completed remediation, and many people are still waiting. The tower itself stood for years after the fire, wrapped in white protective sheeting, visible from across the city, a presence the surrounding neighborhood could not forget or ignore. There is something in that image that speaks to everything. A building that had been clad in the first place to look better, to blend in, to stop being an eyesore in a wealthy borough, now covered in white and standing as an unmissable monument to what happens when the wrong decisions are made for the wrong reasons. The decision to demolish it was eventually made, each of its 24 floors expected to take roughly a month to bring down carefully, and when it is gone, a memorial will be built on the site, still being designed, with the families and survivors' promise that their voices will guide the process. A promise many of them are watching with the particular attention of people who know from experience what it means when promises are made to them. A survivor named Emma, who escaped from the 20th floor on the night of the fire, said something that stays with you long after you hear it. None of the inquiry's findings told the community anything it did not already know. They had already known what happened and why, had been saying it for years in blog posts that were legally threatened, in petitions that were filed and forgotten, in formal complaints about broken systems and faulty fire doors, and an organization that had made a culture of not listening. All of it had been there, documented and on the record before a single person died. A man named Kareem, whose uncle died on the top floor, framed it differently. He said that the system is not broken. He said it was built this way, built so that when things go wrong and people lose their lives, those responsible are able to continue, to prosper, to carry on. And that is the conclusion that 7 years of investigation and 1,700 pages of findings ultimately arrived at. Not a failure of knowledge, but a failure of whose safety was considered worth protecting and whose was not. So what does Grenfell teach us? It teaches us that fire safety in the building you live in is not something to take for granted. If you live in a high-rise, find out what your building is clad with. Ask your landlord or management company directly. And if you cannot get a clear answer, contact your local fire brigade. Know where your fire exits are and how many staircases your building has. If you are ever in a high-rise fire and the exterior is burning, do not wait for instructions that may never come. Get out. The stay-put policy failed the people of Grenfell Tower because it assumed the fire would stay inside. If you see it climbing the outside of your building, leave immediately. Beyond your own building, Grenfell is a reminder that the people who raise safety concerns in their community deserve to be heard, not dismissed, not legally threatened, not written off as troublemakers. If your neighbors are warning about something, listen. If you are in a position of responsibility, whether as a landlord, a building manager, a council official, or a contractor, the lives of the people inside those walls are in your hands, and that is not a metaphor. 72 people died in a fire that 7 years of investigation concluded was entirely avoidable. Every one of those deaths happened because somebody, somewhere in a long chain of decisions, chose convenience or cost or appearances over the safety of people who were depending on them. That is the lesson of Grenfell Tower, and it belongs to all of us.